are places in this world that should never be entered. Rooms that whisper secrets of the past. Shadows that seem to move when no one is looking. Tonight, we step inside one of those places. A house long forgotten. A house with a story so disturbing, so terrifying, that even time itself refuses to erase its horrors. Before we begin this chilling journey into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button. It helps keep the darkness at bay. Subscribe if you dare, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. But be warned, some stories are better left untold. Now, let's begin. I moved into that apartment because it was all I could afford. It was a small, depressing unit in a rundown social housing complex. The kind of place where the walls are thin and the air always smells like damp concrete. But I didn't care. I was trying to get my life together, and after years of bad decisions, this was my fresh start. The building itself wasn't the worst part, though. That honor belonged to the mansion next door. A massive, decaying beast of a house, looming over everything like a corpse, too stubborn to rot away. I didn't know much about it, only that it had been abandoned for decades, and no one seemed interested in tearing it down. The windows were all boarded up, except for a few that had been broken by squatters, or maybe just time itself. At night, the place looked like a black hole, swallowing what little light the street lamps could offer. At first, I ignored it. I had bigger problems to deal with than some creepy old house. But after a few days, I started noticing something weird. The alley between my building and the mansion, just a narrow stretch of cracked pavement lined with garbage and dead weeds, seemed smaller. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but every time I looked out my window, the space between the two buildings looked tighter, like the mansion was pressing closer. I even tried measuring it one night, using the tiles on my floor as a reference point. I counted 15 tiles from my window to where the alley should have started. The next morning, I counted again. 14. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had miscounted. Maybe I was just tired. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I started watching the alley more closely, glancing at it every time I passed by the window. And every day, it seemed narrower. I asked one of my neighbors about it, an older woman who had lived in the complex for years. She just shrugged, said something about how the mansion had always felt too close, then changed the subject. That was the first time I felt it like the house was watching me, waiting for me to notice. Then the squatters started talking. There was a group of them, maybe 5 or 6, crashing in one of the abandoned apartments on the lower floors. I didn't talk to them much, but I overheard them one night in the hallway. One of them, a guy named Will, was freaking out. He kept saying the mansion had moved again, that the walls weren't where they were supposed to be. The others laughed it off, said he was high, but I could hear the edge of fear in their voices. That's when I knew I wasn't the only one who had noticed. That same night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street below made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I got up and went to the window, half expecting to see something different, and I did. The alley was almost gone. What had once been a narrow but visible gap between my building and the mansion was now a sliver of darkness, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. My stomach twisted. Buildings don't move. They don't shift in the middle of the night. But there it was, undeniable. The mansion was closer. The next morning, Will was gone. His friends thought he had taken off, maybe found a better place to crash, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I asked one of the squatters, a girl with stringy blonde hair and dark circles under her eyes, if he had said anything before he disappeared. She hesitated, then told me in a whisper that Will had been obsessed with the mansion. He swore he had seen a new window appear overnight, one that hadn't been there before. The last thing he said was that he was going to check it out. By that evening, the squatters were restless. They were still pretending Will had just taken off, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't believe it. One of them, a guy in a torn hoodie, muttered something about how things had been off for a while. The mansion wasn't just old, he said. It was wrong. The walls inside didn't line up the way they should. Hallways went on longer than they used to. Windows vanished and reappeared. I didn't want to hear any of it. I told myself it was just paranoia, that we were all feeding off each other's fear. But deep down, I knew something was happening, and it was getting worse. That night, I locked my door and tried not to think about it. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but as I lay there in the dark, a sound cut through the silence. A long, slow creaking, like wood shifting under weight. It was coming from outside. My pulse pounded as I forced myself to look. I pulled back the curtain, just an inch, just enough to see. The mansion was closer. Not by much, but enough that I knew I wasn't losing my mind. The alley that had been there yesterday was gone. My building and the mansion were now flush against each other, brick to brick. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming too fast. This wasn't just in my head. This wasn't just paranoia. The mansion had moved. I pressed my back against the wall, listening, waiting, half expecting to hear something shifting inside the building. Some sign that I wasn't alone, but there was nothing. Just an awful, heavy silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up like a child hiding from a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare, it was real. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a sound, a deep, wet scraping. It came from the wall behind my bed, the wall that was now touching the mansion. It wasn't a rat, wasn't the pipes. It was slower, more deliberate, like something dragging itself through the dark. My stomach turned as I realized what it sounded like: fingernails against wood. I held my breath, listening, too terrified to move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. But before I could convince myself it was over, the smell hit me. A damp, rotting stench, seeping through the cracks. And under it, something worse, metallic temps, sharp and unmistakable. Blood. I gagged, clamping a hand over my mouth. The stench was thick, cloying, like something had been festering just beyond the wall for weeks. I wanted to run, to get out of that apartment and never come back, but my body wouldn't move. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay still, to not make a sound. Then another noise, a faint rhythmic tapping. Not random, not the building settling. It was deliberate, a pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. Like someone was knocking? No, not knocking, calling. I forced myself to my feet, heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to leave now. I grabbed my phone and shoes, but as I turned toward the door, something caught my eye. The wall, the one that had been solid brick just yesterday. There was something on it now. My breath hitched. A door that hadn't been there before. It was old, wooden, with peeling white paint and a tarnished brass knob. And worst of all, it was slightly open, just enough for me to see the darkness waiting beyond. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, that stress, exhaustion, or just pure insanity had finally caught up to me. But the door was real. The smell was real. The silence pressing in on me was real. I took a shaky step back, but the floor felt unsteady beneath me, like the whole apartment was shifting. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out before something came through that door. But I couldn't move. I could only stare into that sliver of darkness, waiting for something to emerge. Then, the door creaked, just slightly, but enough. Enough for me to see the movement inside. A shape, a pale wet hand sliding along the edge of the frame. Long fingers, too long, pressing into the wood like they were testing it, like they were testing reality itself. My vision blurred as panic took over, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then the fingers curled, they gripped the door, and slowly, so painfully slowly, they began to pull it open. My entire body went cold. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, only stare at the door as it opened wider, revealing nothing but pure darkness behind it. The fingers, wet and pale, moved like they were searching for something, pulling the door with ease as though it weighed nothing. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Then, just as the door swung wide enough for a figure to step through, I heard a voice, a low whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably clear. It was soft, almost sweet, and it carried a strange, oppressive weight to it. It was saying my name, not just once, but over and over, in that slow, sing-song way that sends chills straight to your core, Linda. It stretched my name like a twisted lullaby. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I couldn't think, only feel the pull of whatever was waiting behind that door. I knew then I knew that I couldn't stay there any longer. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. Then, out of nowhere, the whisper stopped. The door was wide open now, and all I could hear was my own frantic breathing, echoing in the silence. I took a tentative step forward, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My hands were clammy, heart pounding in my chest like it was about to explode. I knew I was making a mistake, but I couldn't help myself. The darkness behind the door seemed to draw me in, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. Something was waiting for me there, something that wanted me to come closer. I leaned forward just a little, barely a movement, but enough to see something shift in the blackness. A figure, a shape, standing perfectly still. It wasn't human. I could feel it deep in my bones, that it wasn't something that belonged in this world. My stomach twisted violently as I realized that it wasn't just the mansion that had changed. It was me. My reflection, my thoughts, my very sense of self was fading. Then, before I could react, the shape moved. It didn't step forward like I expected, ripped forward, as if it were nothing more than a blur. Too fast for my eyes to process. I stumbled back, colliding with the wall behind me. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with something foul. The floor seemed to vibrate under my feet as if the entire apartment was breathing. Then came the sound, the wet, slithering sound of something dragging itself across the floor. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The sound was getting closer, dragging itself toward me like it was right behind me. I whipped my head around, convinced it was right there, but I couldn't see anything, just the same empty, suffocating darkness. The walls seemed to press in on me, closer, tighter, like the apartment itself was alive and closing in. I fumbled for the door handle, desperately trying to escape, but it was stuck. The door that had once been so easily accessible now felt like it was welded shut. I hammered on it with my fists, feeling the panic rise, but nothing moved, nothing budged. Then I heard it, the softest, most insidious laugh. It wasn't human. It was low, guttural, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. I froze. I had never felt so exposed, so completely helpless. And in that moment, I realized something worse than the laugh itself. The mansion wasn't just absorbing the apartment, it was absorbing me. I was part of it now. The walls were breathing in time with my pulse. The air was thick with the same sickening smell. The mansion wanted me to stay. It was feeding on my fear, twisting everything around me. I don't know how long I stood there, my face pressed against the cold, sweat-slicked door. But when I turned back, the room was different. The layout had shifted. The apartment that was once familiar to me, my only refuge, was now unrecognizable. The furniture was displaced, scattered across the room like it had been violently thrown around. The walls that had been so solid were now warped and bending, as if the apartment itself was trying to stretch and expand. The air felt thicker, denser, and the smell of decay grew stronger, as though the very foundation of the place was rotting. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair that had no business being there, and fell to the floor. I was trembling, tears stinging my eyes. My mind couldn't keep up with what was happening. I tried to stand, but I was disoriented, dizzy, as though the ground beneath me wasn't where it was supposed to be. Something moved across the floor, something large and wet, scraping against the wood like a massive creature dragging itself through the room. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. My legs gave out again, and I fell into the corner, clutching my knees to my chest. It wasn't just the mansion. It wasn't just the apartment. The whole complex was changing. My neighbors, the squatters, the people who had lived here. We were all part of it now. The house was consuming everything around it, swallowing us whole. I could hear them now, whispers coming from the cracks, from the walls, from the darkness. Some of the whispers were familiar, voices I recognized from the hallway, from the people I'd seen on my way in. They were all gone now. I could hear them pleading, crying, their voices warping into something unrecognizable. Something was happening to them, too. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel them all around me, creeping into my mind, filling my thoughts with panic. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were alive and breathing with me, trapping me inside a nightmare. I looked around frantically, but there was no way out. The hallway that led to the exit, if there had ever been one, was gone, replaced by endless twisting corridors. The floor beneath me felt like it was sinking, shifting. I was losing track of time, of reality. Everything was bending, distorting. I thought I saw movement at the far end of the room. It was hard to focus, but there was a shadow, tall and misshapen, sliding across the walls like it was made of smoke. I couldn't look away. I had to know what it was, had to see it. It felt like the house the thing wanted me to see it, like it was luring me in. Slowly, I crawled forward, each movement heavy, as though my body was dragging through thick mud. The shadow loomed closer, twisting in the corners of my vision, pulling at my consciousness. Then, I felt the sharp sting of something wet on my skin. I looked down to see the floor covered in a thick, black sludge. It wasn't just on the floor, it was creeping up my legs, my arms, its tendrils pulling at my clothes. Panic surged through me as I tried to wipe it off, but the sludge was sticky, alive, and it clung to me like a parasite. My body jerked, but it wouldn't stop. It was pulling me deeper into the room, into the heart of the mansion, where something worse was waiting. I couldn't move. The sludge had me trapped, its grip tightening with every passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, but it felt like the sound was coming from far away, like I was hearing it through a thick fog. The air was suffocating now, and my body was being dragged, inch by inch, toward that shadow. The dark figure at the far end of the room seemed to be growing, towering over me as if it had no end, no limit. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt muted, swallowed up by the walls around me. And then I saw it, the most terrifying thing of all. A door, standing by itself, in the middle of the room. A wooden door that hadn't been there moments ago. A door that looked completely out of place. But this door wasn't just a way out, it was a trap. I knew, deep down, that whatever lay beyond it was even worse than what I was already facing. The shadow, now more solid than before, seemed to be pointing toward it, urging me to come closer. I wanted to turn away, to fight the pull, but it was like I was being forced toward that door. The more I resisted, the harder the sludge clung to me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. They were no longer just voices. They were commands, demands. I had to open the door. I had to go through. My body was no longer mine. It was as if the mansion had taken over, consuming every part of me. My own mind was slipping away, drowned out by the force of whatever had claimed this place. The door creaked open by itself, and I was pulled through. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything shifted. The world around me warped, like I was falling into an abyss. But instead of the floor below, I felt as though I was sinking into something soft and wet, like flesh. My body trembled uncontrollably. The air inside the new space was thick, viscous, like breathing through a layer of oil. My hands slid across the walls, slick and cold, as I tried to steady myself. But they weren't just walls, they felt wrong. They pulsed, like they were alive, beating with a rhythm I couldn't comprehend. I took a hesitant step forward, and the floor groaned beneath me, as if it were barely able to hold my weight. My vision blurred, but I could make out twisted, half-formed shapes, half human, half melded with the walls themselves. I wanted to run, but my legs were unresponsive. The whispers returned, this time louder, surrounding me, coming from everywhere at once. They spoke in unison, a chorus of unintelligible voices, but the meaning behind them was clear. Stay with us. Become one with us. I tried to scream, but my mouth felt as if it had been sewn shut. I was trapped, unable to escape the suffocating pressure of the mansion. It had already claimed me. Then, I saw them, figures in the distance, or at least, I thought I saw them. People who looked like they were once alive, their bodies stretched and contorted, their faces unrecognizable, their eyes hollow. They moved toward me slowly, deliberately, their forms shifting and warping with every step. They were the others, the squatters, the people who had vanished, the ones whose screams I had heard echoing through the walls. They weren't gone, not entirely. They had become part of the mansion, just like me. They weren't just dead, they were changed, living in a form that no longer resembled anything human. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The closer the figures came, the more the air seemed to thicken around me. It felt like I was drowning, but I couldn't stop breathing, couldn't stop gasping for air that wasn't there. The sounds of their footsteps echoed, their movements slow but deliberate, like they were dragging something heavy behind them. The walls around me seemed to breathe with them, every motion from the figures sending a ripple through the place, as if the mansion was alive, pulsating, beating off their misery and mine. One of them, Will, I recognized him, was closest to me now. His face a contorted mess of flesh, but his eyes, those same eyes I had seen before, still locked onto mine with a sense of eerie recognition. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, just a gurgling sound that echoed in my skull. The others around him mimicked his movements, their mouths opening in sync, their eyes unblinking, fixated on me. I wanted to cry out, but my throat was dry, the weight of the air pressing on me, suffocating me. My thoughts were slipping away, melting into the thickening darkness, and all I could focus on was them. As they got closer, I could feel their presence inside me, pushing against my skin, pushing inside my mind. I wasn't sure what was happening anymore. Was this real? Was I dying? Was this all some kind of nightmare I hadn't woken up from? The walls groaned. The floor beneath me crackled like dry leaves, and I felt myself slowly being drawn into them, into that horrible, twisted mass of bodies and walls that were all becoming one. I was becoming part of the mansion. I could feel my flesh stretching, merging with the walls, the wetness of the sludge creeping up my legs. My body wasn't mine anymore. And then, the whispers. They weren't whispers anymore. They were laughter. The laughter was deafening, a sickening sound that echoed through every inch of the space, rattling my bones, shattering my thoughts. It wasn't just coming from the figures anymore, it was coming from everywhere. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air I breathed. The voices had shifted, their tone now mocking, almost joyful, as if the mansion itself was celebrating its victory over me. The sound seemed to distort everything, warping my perception of what was real. I could see flashes brief, horrifying glimpses of the others, of Will, of faces I didn't recognize, all trapped in the same nightmare, their bodies half-formed, part of the shifting breathing mass of the mansion. I could feel myself slipping, losing control. My hands reached out, but there was nothing to grab onto. The walls were now soft, like living skin, pulsing with a sickly warmth. My fingers sank into them, the flesh giving way as if the mansion itself was inviting me to become part of it, to surrender. The air tasted metallic, and the ground beneath me was no longer solid, but rippling, like it was made of some kind of thick liquid that pulled at me as I tried to stand. The mansion wanted me. It had been calling me. I was a part of it now. It was in my veins, in my soul. I turned, desperate to escape, but there was no way out. The door was gone just like everything else. The hallway stretched infinitely, pulling me forward, further into the abyss. I was moving without meaning to, my body no longer mine to control. The whispers were louder now, urging me, telling me to keep going, to keep moving. I wasn't sure if I was walking or if the floor was carrying me, dragging me deeper into the heart of the mansion. The figures surrounded me now, their bodies shifting and changing in ways that defied logic. Some of them were already part of the mansion, their limbs twisted, their faces unrecognizable. The others, those who hadn't yet been absorbed, looked at me with empty eyes. There was no humanity left in them, just hunger and something else, something worse. They didn't just want me to join them. They wanted me to suffer, to become the mansion, just like them. I stumbled, my body no longer responding to my commands. I had no idea where I was or how much time had passed, but the walls seemed to be closing in, pressing against me from every side. The laughter, that awful sound, was still there, but now it was mixed with a low, growling noise, like the mansion itself was hungry, starving for something. I felt a pressure building inside my chest, as though the very air was turning to concrete, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I was too far gone. I looked around, but the hallways had shifted again, turning into something unrecognizable. The layout had changed, the walls twisting and bending into impossible shapes. It was like the mansion had eaten everything that once belonged to this place, and now it was reshaping itself. I couldn't even find the apartment complex anymore, the place that had once felt like a fragile sanctuary. Now, it was nothing but a memory, swallowed up by the mansion's insatiable hunger. As I was dragged forward, I saw a door ahead, the only thing that didn't seem to be part of the mansion's twisted body. It was an old, wooden door. Nothing extraordinary about it, but as I approached, I felt a sudden surge of panic. Something was behind that door, something worse than the walls. I had to get away from it, but I couldn't stop walking. My legs were moving against my will, my feet dragging me closer to that cursed door. I knew it was my only chance to escape, but escape to what? The thought barely formed before it was drowned by the overpowering force that surrounded me. The voices grew louder, the pressure against my skull unbearable. I was losing myself, losing my sense of what was real and what wasn't. But I reached the door. I reached out, desperate, to grab the handle. The moment my hand touched it, everything stopped. For a split second, everything was silent. The voices, the laughter, the growling, all of it vanished, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the world. My hand was still on the door, but I wasn't sure if I was supposed to turn the handle or leave it alone. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was able to breathe. But that brief moment of clarity didn't last long. The silence was replaced by a low hum that filled the air, vibrating through my chest, making my teeth rattle. The door shifted under my fingers. I couldn't pull away, it wouldn't let me. Something was drawing me in, pulling me into the very core of the mansion. The door was no longer just a door, it was part of the mansion itself, alive and pulsing with a rhythm of its own. The hum grew louder, louder, until it felt like my bones were vibrating with it. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs were frozen in place. I had no control anymore. I was just there. Then it happened. The door opened. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't like how a door should open. It cracked open, as if something behind it was forcing it open. Something enormous and monstrous. Something that had been waiting for me. A thick, putrid stench flooded my senses. The smell of rot and decay, like something had died in there centuries ago. My stomach churned, but I couldn't turn away. I needed to know what was behind it. The door creaked as it swung further open, and in that moment, the laughter returned, faint at first, but it grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't just the mansion laughing. It was the voices of everyone who had come before me, trapped within the walls, their souls twisted into something unrecognizable. I felt them pressing in from all sides, urging me to enter. Enter and join us. I stepped forward. I didn't know why. I didn't want to, but I did. As I crossed the threshold, the world around me twisted again. The hallway behind me disappeared, swallowed up by the blackness that surged forward. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could feel the presence of the mansion in every inch of the space. It was everywhere, its breath heavy and suffocating, its walls pulsing, groaning with life, if you could call it that. I felt my skin crawl as something brushed against me, something cold and slick, like a vine made of flesh. I tried to turn back, to find the door, but it was already gone. The moment I stepped inside, the mansion claimed me, and there was no going back. The walls had started to close in again, pressing tighter, pushing me deeper into the heart of this living nightmare. The floors beneath me gave way in places, as if they, too, were shifting with the mansion. I stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden change, and found myself falling into a void that had no bottom, no end. I braced myself, expecting to crash, but instead, I was caught by something soft, something sticky, like I was falling into the very flesh of the building itself. My hands sank into it as if it was absorbing me, pulling me deeper into its maw. The air was thick, suffocating, and the whispers had returned louder now, clearer, but also more personal. It wasn't just the voices anymore. It was as if the mansion was speaking directly to me, using my own thoughts to twist the words. "You're a part of me now," it seemed to say. "You'll never leave. You belong here." I tried to scream, but my throat was thick, heavy. The mansion's pulse was in my head, in my chest. I could feel my heartbeat sensing with its rhythm, as though I was becoming a part of it, my blood mixing with its. It wanted me. No, it needed me. Then I heard something I wasn't prepared for, a sound that froze me in place. The door had opened again, or rather, the space I had just walked through had returned to existence. I turned my head toward it. I didn't know if I was hallucinating, but there, in the distance, was a door I thought was gone forever, and behind it, a faint outline of light, something real. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran, the pulsing walls shifting in front of me, blocking my path, forcing me to reroute again and again. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going, just desperate to reach that door. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm matching the mansion's unsettling pulse, like it was leading me to something, or maybe dragging me toward my doom. But I couldn't stop, not now. The hallways stretched out impossibly long, and the more I tried to get closer to the door, the further away it seemed to be. I was disoriented, my mind racing, fighting against the claustrophobic feeling that the mansion was closing in on me from all sides. The walls were moving again, shifting, bending, and I could hear the low groan of wood and stone, like the building was alive, breathing with a life of its own. Then, out of nowhere, the floor beneath me gave way again. This time, I wasn't prepared. I fell forward, hitting the ground hard, my body scraping against something wet and slick. My hands sank into the fleshy substance beneath me, like I was sinking into something organic, something alive. I tried to pull away, but it was like the mansion itself was holding me down, forcing me to feel the disgusting texture beneath me. I looked around, panic setting in, but there was no door, no light, nothing. The hallway had completely disappeared, and I was alone in this endless blackness. My breath came in ragged gasps as I clawed at the walls, desperate for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, just the pulsing, the whispers, the oppressive weight of the mansion pushing against me from all directions. I stood there, my knees trembling, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind felt like it was breaking, like the world around me had fractured beyond repair. The mansion was consuming everything, and I was no exception. It had already begun to feed on me, twisting my perception, warping reality, until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. I wasn't just trapped in its walls, I was becoming part of it. Then, through the suffocating darkness, I heard something again. A voice, low, faint, but unmistakable. "Join us." I froze. The voice was inside my head now, like a whisper, so close it could have been in my own ear. I didn't know if I was imagining it or if the mansion had truly spoken. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I struggled to stand. I could feel the walls moving around me, closing in, like the mansion was eager to claim me. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of rot and decay. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling something alive, something that wasn't supposed to be in the air. I wiped my face, and when I pulled my hand away, I saw the blood. I hadn't even realized I'd been bleeding. But now the dark, sticky substance was everywhere, smeared across my hands and arms. It was like the mansion's grip was getting tighter, suffocating me in its disgusting embrace. I stumbled forward, my mind going blank. The only thing that mattered now was getting away from the voice, from the darkness, from this thing that wanted to consume me. I didn't know how much time had passed. I couldn't tell anymore. The mansion was playing with time, bending it, distorting it like everything else. It was taking pieces of me, breaking me down. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, choked by the feeling that the walls themselves were listening, waiting for me to lose control. In the distance, I thought I saw something. No, someone. The shape was distorted, twisted, but there was a figure there, moving in the blackness. My heart skipped a beat. Was it another survivor? Or was it just another illusion the mansion had created to toy with me? I wanted to call out, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something told me that whatever it wasn't there to help me. I kept moving, ignoring the voice that seemed to be growing louder in my mind, urging me to turn back. "Join us," it said again. The whisper was almost seductive, like a siren calling to me, and I could feel my resolve slipping, my sanity unraveling. Suddenly, I found myself standing at the edge of a hallway, and ahead of me there it was. A door, a wooden door, cracked open just slightly, with a dim light coming from behind it. I don't know why I didn't hesitate this time. Maybe I was just too tired, too broken, but I moved toward it, my body moving as if it had a mind of its own, like the mansion was pulling me in. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold wood. It felt real solid, unyielding. For a moment, I thought I might actually make it out of this nightmare. The air seemed too thin, the pressure on my chest easing just a little as I pushed the door open. What I saw on the other side almost broke me. The room was small, dimly lit by an unnatural light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. But it wasn't the room that made my heart stop, it was the things inside it. The walls were covered in what looked like old photographs, faded and stained. But when I looked closer, I realized they weren't photos at all. They were faces, faces pressed into the wallpaper, their eyes wide open, staring at me, silently screaming. My body went cold, and I could feel my legs giving way beneath me. But I forced myself to stay standing, my mind screaming to run. I couldn't look away. I didn't know what it was, but the more I stared, the more I felt something pulling me closer to the room. Like the faces, like the walls, everything was waiting for me. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me, and I rushed for the door, trying to get out, but it was too late. The room was no longer a room. It was shifting. The walls began to close in on me, warping like they were alive. The faces on the walls stretching and distorting, as if the mansion itself was feeding on my fear. I could hear it now, the walls, the mansion whispering, calling, urging me to come closer, to join them. "You belong here." The voice was everywhere now, in my head, in my ears, in my bones. I backed away, my heart pounding so loudly I couldn't hear my own breath anymore. But there was no escape. The walls were closing in, the faces were moving, and I was losing my grip on reality. My mind was splitting, and I could feel myself slipping. The more I tried to resist, the more the mansion pulled me in. And then, in the distance, I heard a familiar voice. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's I knew, but it was calling to me. and I was so close to understanding. I don't know how I knew, but I did. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was alive. It was feeding, and it wasn't done with me yet. The voice echoed again, louder this time, closer. I couldn't tell if it was real or just another trick of the mansion, but it felt so vivid, so alive, that I couldn't ignore it. It was as if the very walls were speaking to me, calling me to cross the threshold, to give in. The air grew thick with an oppressive force, pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the now deformed walls. The faces on them seemed to twist and writhe, as though they were alive, their mouths opening in silent screams. I wanted to scream too, but my throat felt like it was closing up, choking me. The walls seemed to pulse, almost as if the mansion was breathing, drawing me deeper into its horrific embrace. I turned away from the faces, desperately searching for an exit, but the room had transformed. The floor had become soft, like it was made of flesh, squelching beneath my feet as I moved. I could feel the mansion shifting again, growing, stretching. It wasn't just consuming space, it was consuming me, warping my mind, twisting my reality. Every step felt like I was sinking into a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The whispers came again, louder, more insistent. Come closer, you belong. The sound was all around me, vibrating through the very walls of my skull. The darkness in the room was no longer just a lack of light. It was alive, hungry, and it wanted me. The door that had once been my escape now felt like a trap, pulling me in even as I tried to resist. I turned toward the far corner of the room where something had caught my eye, a small wooden box. It sat there, innocently, on an old, rotting table. But I knew I had to get to it. Something in me, some primal instinct, told me it held the key to what was happening, to what the mansion wanted. I reached for the box, trembling as I lifted it. The weight of it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in this space. As soon as my fingers touched it, I felt a sharp pain, like needles digging into my skin. I pulled my hand back in a panic, but I had already made contact. I knew something had changed, that the mansion's presence had deepened. The box was part of the reason it was so hungry. As I pulled my hand away, I heard a cracking sound. The floor beneath me gave way, and I fell, a deep, endless fall that seemed to last forever. I couldn't tell where the floor had gone or what was happening to me. All I knew was that the mansion was not going to let me leave. It wasn't going to let anyone leave. The fall seemed endless. My body slammed into what felt like a soft surface, but I couldn't register the pain, just the feeling of being swallowed. The room, the walls, the mansion itself were all around me, pressing in from every direction, closing off any chance of escape. It was as if the house had become an entity, an enormous, breathing creature that wanted to consume me whole. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaky, my mind swirling. I could feel it now, the pulse of the mansion's low steady, like a heartbeat that matched my own. It was everywhere, beneath my skin, in the air, inside my head. The floor was no longer solid. It was like I was walking on something alive, a flesh-like surface that quivered under my weight. The whispers returned, louder now, as if they were inside me, pushing me toward something. You are part of us now. Come closer. Join us. I could feel myself being pulled again, unwillingly, toward the depths of the mansion. The walls stretched and twisted in ways that defied logic, and I knew that every corner, every hallway, was being reshaped around me, trapping me further. There was no way out. In the distance, I saw movement, dark shadows flitting in and out of sight. My pulse quickened. They were there. The people, the ones who had vanished before me. I recognized their faces, distorted and warped by the mansion's grip, their eyes wide with the same horror I now felt. They were staring at me, begging with their eyes, but their mouths, they were silent. They couldn't speak. They had become part of the mansion's nightmare too. I tried to run, to fight against the pull that was dragging me deeper into the heart of the house, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. The shadows were closing in on me, surrounding me. The voices grew louder. It's too late. You're already here. You're already ours. I stumbled and fell, and that was when I realized the truth. It wasn't just the mansion that had consumed MIT, it was everything around it. The entire building, the complex, the alleyway, it was all part of it now. The mansion was expanding, growing, devouring anything it touched, and there was no escaping it. The walls were closing in on me, crushing me with their suffocating presence. Then, something strange happened. The whispers stopped. The walls stopped moving. The air grew still, cold, and in that silence, I heard it in my own voice, soft and distant, calling out to me. But it wasn't me. It was the mansion, speaking through me, pulling me into its grip more tightly than ever before. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt as though the mansion had become my very body, as though my mind was dissolving into the walls. The silence was crushing. And then, I heard something far worse than the whispers, the soft, sickening thud of footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't just the mansion now. Something else was here with me. Something that was moving through its ever-shifting maze. The steps were slow, deliberate, and heavy. I could hear them drawing closer, growing louder, until I could feel the very vibrations under my feet. I turned around slowly, my eyes wide, my breath shallow. In the flickering shadows of the mansion's twisted halls, I saw a figure emerging, distorted and unfamiliar, moving like it was being pulled by invisible strings. Its outline blurred, like smoke. But there was something wrong about it, something monstrous. It didn't belong here, yet it felt inevitable, as if it had always been here, waiting for me to finally notice it. I tried to scream, but the sound never left my throat. The mansion was choking me, its walls constricting, its air thick with the metallic taste of fear. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating the space between us. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something that had been in the house, something that was the house. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the twisted, decaying light that hung in the air. And then it spoke, or rather, whispered, but it felt like 1,000 voices all at once. You've come so far, but this is where it ends. Before I could respond, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, like something was tearing through my ribs. I gasped, struggling for air, but the mansion had already begun to absorb me further. The walls began to close in around me, folding like they were alive, and the pain was unbearable, like I was being pulled apart. I collapsed to the floor, feeling the coldness of the flesh-like surface against my skin. I could feel myself melting into the house, the dark energy of the mansion slipping into every pore. The figure was standing over me now, its presence suffocating, the laughter of the house itself echoing in my head. My mind was unraveling, and I could feel myself slipping away, piece by piece. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went still. The pain stopped, the whispers stopped, the footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. But when I opened my eyes, I saw nothing. The mansion had swallowed everything time-space, people leaving only the cold, infinite blackness. I was inside it now, and I could feel the mansion's pulse beneath my skin, breathing with me. Time had lost all meaning. I couldn't remember how long I had been there, wandering through the endless blackness of the mansion. It felt like days, or maybe just seconds. The walls, the hallways, everything seemed to stretch on infinitely, warping and bending like a dream, or maybe a nightmare that was never going to end. I could hear the whispers again, but this time they weren't distant. They were inside me, surrounding me, pulling at my mind like invisible hands. They were urging me forward, deeper into the house, towards something I couldn't understand, something that felt both terrifying and familiar. The closer I got, the stronger the pull became, as though the mansion itself was hungry, waiting for me to come closer, to surrender completely. I stumbled down a new hallway, my legs shaky, my breath ragged. There were no doors, no windows, just walls that stretched endlessly around me. But then I saw something at the end of the corridor, faint but unmistakable. A light flickered a dim, ghostly glow. My heart skipped. Could it be an exit? A way out? I moved toward it, my feet dragging, the whispers louder now, urging me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. I was too close. I had to know what was at the end of this hallway. It might be my only chance. As I got closer, I could make out a shape in the flickering light. A door solid wooden, old. It didn't belong here. It was out of place. A relic in a house that had forgotten what it was. But something about it called to me. Something primal, like the mansion itself wanted me to open it. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, the air thick with tension. Just as my fingers brushed against the cold wood, a sudden, violent shaking coursed through the house. The walls trembled, the ground beneath me buckled, and the door slammed open on its own. Behind it was darkness, an abyss that seemed to swallow everything around it. There was no sound, no air, just pure, suffocating darkness. And then, a voice. "You're not leaving. Not anymore." I turned, desperate to run, but it was too late. The walls of the mansion closed in on me, pushing me back toward the door. The darkness behind it was pulling at me, trying to drag me in. I realized, too late, that the door wasn't an escape, it was just another part of the mansion. It was pulling me in, pulling me deeper into the house's twisted heart. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the hollow silence. There was no one left to hear me. There was only the mansion. I fought, I scratched, I clawed at the walls, desperate to break free. But it was like they were made of living flesh, closing in on me with each passing second. The cold, clammy surface of the house pressed against my skin, its pulses rhythmic, unnatural. Every part of me screamed to escape, but my body felt heavy, as though the mansion was draining every ounce of strength from me. I couldn't move fast enough. The darkness behind the door seemed to grow larger, more consuming. My head was spinning, and the whispers, the voices had intensified, each one melding with the other until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the next began. The words, threats, promises, laughs flooded my mind, smothering all logic. They told me I was part of the mansion now, that I would never leave, that I had always been part of it. A sharp pain shot through my chest. I looked down to see that the walls were now touching me. The air was thick with something rancid, a sticky, vile substance that burned my skin where it made contact. I screamed again, but this time, the mansion swallowed the sound before it could escape my throat. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't just consuming the apartment complex, it was consuming me. Every inch of my body, every thought, every breath being drawn into the house's insatiable hunger. And then, the floor beneath me gave way. I didn't fall. I was sucked in, dragged into the black abyss that had been growing behind the door. It was cold, unfeeling, and dark. I felt myself stretching, my limbs being pulled apart as though I were being torn from within. "This is who you are now," the voice said. "You're part of it. You're part of the house." I wanted to scream, to deny it, but I couldn't. The sensation of my own skin melding with the walls, the cold, suffocating pull of the mansion's hunger, it was overwhelming. I could feel myself slipping away, like I wasn't even me anymore. I was just another part of the mansion, an extension of its living, breathing form. The last thing I remember is a single thought. It will never stop. It will keep growing. It will keep consuming, and there's no end to it. And then there was nothing. When I came to, I didn't know where I was anymore. I opened my eyes, but there was no difference between what was real and what wasn't. The air felt thick, heavy, as if I were underwater. I couldn't hear anything except for the distant, low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My head was spinning, and I could barely sit up. The world around me was a blur, but there was something movement in the corner of my vision. I tried to focus, but it was as if the very act of focusing took all the strength I had left. The world around me twisted and flickered like a bad signal, like static on a broken TV screen. I could make out shapes, dark, indistinct forms moving through the shadows. But the real terror wasn't in the shapes themselves. It was in the sensation that I wasn't alone. I was being watched. A shadow passed in front of me, and for a moment, I swore I saw a Faisa, pale, contorted face, staring directly at me. I froze, but before I could react, it disappeared into the darkness, and the whispers returned. "Not yet, not yet. You're not ready." I tried to move, to get up and run, but my limbs wouldn't respond. The darkness, thick as tar, clung to me, pulling me back. It was like the mansion didn't want me to leave. My own body didn't even belong to me anymore. It was as if I had become part of the house, fused into it. I reached down to touch my skin, and I felt something wet, something warm. My fingers came away sticky, coated in some foul, glistening substance. I tried not to panic, but it was impossible. It felt like everything around me was alive. The walls pulsed, the floor shifted beneath me. The house, no, the mansion was alive, and it was changing me. Every breath, every thought. It was slowly erasing what I had been, what I used to be. I couldn't even remember what it felt like to be human anymore. There was just the mansion, just this suffocating, endless void that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, in a flash, a doorway appeared. At first, I thought it was a trick, another hallucination, brought on by the madness creeping into my mind. But no, it was real. The doorway was solid, old, like the one I had seen before. It looked normal, but I knew better than to trust it. Still, something inside me, some desperate part, drove me to rise and move toward it. I wasn't sure if I wanted to escape, or if I just needed to prove to myself that I could still make choices, still do something. I staggered toward the door, each step heavier than the last. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, but I ignored them, pushing forward. The door was close now. I could see the tarnished brass doorknob, the faded wood, and with trembling hands, I reached for it. The second my hand touched the knob, everything froze. It was as if time itself had stopped. The air went still, and the house note, the mansion, seemed to hold its breath. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, and for a moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was the end. Maybe I had finally reached the point where I would either escape or disappear completely into the mansion. I twisted the knob, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing only more darkness beyond. But it wasn't the kind of darkness I had expected. There was no hint of the familiar hallway I had seen earlier, no faint outline of an exit. This darkness felt alive, like it was waiting for me to step in, ready to swallow me whole. And yet, there was something comforting about it, something that almost felt like home. It wasn't right. It shouldn't have felt comforting, but it did. The whispers grew softer, almost like a lullaby. The pull toward the darkness was so strong, so overwhelming. It felt like I was the one being invited in now, not the other way around. But I couldn't give in. I couldn't. Not yet. Not when I could still feel the remnants of my old self, the last traces of my own will fighting to break free. I turned my head away from the door, looking back at the twisted, shifting space around me. The walls moved, the floor buckled. The mansion was alive, and it was trying to reshape me, change me, force me to become part of it, part of something I couldn't understand. I didn't know if I could fight it anymore. I didn't know if I wanted to. I took a step back, but the floor shifted again beneath me. I lost my footing, and before I could stop myself, I was falling. The air rushed around me, cold and suffocating, and I landed hard on something soft, sticky, and wet. It was as though the mansion had decided, for me this was my place now. The whispers returned, but this time, they weren't words anymore. They were screams, low, guttural, filled with agony. They sounded like they were coming from inside, me, like the mansion had taken root in my very soul. My mind was no longer my own. It was as if the house had reached deep into my thoughts, twisting them, merging with my every memory. The pain of it was unbearable. I could feel the walls closing in again. And it wasn't just the walls this time, it was everything. The house, the air, the shadows. They were pulling at me, trying to consume me completely. And then I heard something else, something far worse than the whispers. I heard laughter. The laughter wasn't human. It was hollow, warped, as though it had been twisted by some dark force, until it barely resembled a laugh at all. It echoed in the pit of my stomach, crawling under my skin, suffocating me from the inside out. It was everywhere, reverberating off the walls, curling into my ears, filling my mind. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It was part of me now. I tried to scream, but the sound was muffled, as if the mansion was drowning me in its own oppressive, malignant presence. I could feel the walls closing in, the floor rippling like water beneath me. It was all around me, this endless, stretching nightmare, a living thing that had consumed everything in its path. And now, it was trying to consume me. I pushed myself up, my body shaking, barely able to move, but I couldn't stop myself. There was something pulling me forward, a force stronger than any fear I had ever felt. I stumbled across the floor, the wet, sticky surface sucking at my feet, and there, in front of me, I saw it. A figure, pale, lurking in the shadows. For a second, I thought I was imagining things, the last remnants of my mind trying to hold on to something real, something familiar. But no, it was real. It was standing there, just beyond the flickering light that barely lit the hallway. The figure was wrong. There was no face, just a hollowed-out shape where the features should have been. But I could feel its eyes. I could feel it watching me. I froze, my body trembling uncontrollably. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. Its presence felt like it was suffocating the air around me, pressing down on me. The laughter continued, louder now, as if it was coming from inside the figure. I should have run. I should have screamed, but I couldn't. I could hardly breathe. I could only stand there, frozen, as the figure took one slow, deliberate step toward me. Then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, everything was different. The air was thick, suffocating, like the weight of it was pressing me into the ground. The walls, no, the whole room had shifted. It was as if the mansion had rearranged itself while I was unconscious. There were no longer any clear hallways or familiar rooms. Just endless, writhing corridors that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. I couldn't tell where the floor ended and the walls began. I felt like I was drowning, trapped in some nightmare, where every step I took only led me deeper into the mansion's suffocating grip. The laughter was gone now, but in its place, there was something worse. A silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's watching you, pressing on you, waiting for you to make a sound, any sound, so it can consume you. I reached out, my hand brushing against the cold, slimy surface of a wall, my fingers sinking into it as if it were some kind of living flesh. I recoiled, but the wall seemed to cling to me, the sticky residue pulling at my skin. Every part of the mansion was like this now, alive, pulsing with a sick, unnatural energy. It was as if the very structure of the place was feeding on me, on my fear, on my desperation. I took a step back, trying to calm myself, but as I moved, the ground shifted beneath me, buckling like it was alive. I had no idea where I was anymore. The mansion had taken everything, my surroundings, my sense of time, my grip on reality. It was all slipping away, and I was just a part of it now. And then I heard something, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the corridor was empty. There was nothing there, but the scratching continued, closer now, moving along the walls, circling around me. It was the sound of something crawling, something small, something creeping, coming for me. I tried to push forward, to move away from whatever was making that noise, but my legs refused to cooperate. Every movement felt sluggish, as if the air itself was pulling me back. I could barely breathe. The walls were closing in again, and that sound, it was getting louder, closer, like it was right behind me. My pulse was so loud in my ears, I thought it might burst my eardrums. The scratching stopped abruptly. Silence again, but not the same silence as before. This time, it felt like the silence had weight, like it was expecting something. I held my breath, straining to listen, trying to catch any sound that might give me a clue as to what was going on. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and then, out of nowhere, a door appeared. It wasn't there before. I knew that for sure. One moment, the wall was solid, featureless. The next, a wooden door stood in front of me, weathered and old, but somehow familiar. It wasn't just any door. It was the door that I had seen in that fleeting vision, the one I couldn't remember clearly, but felt like I had been waiting for. I reached out to touch it, my hand trembling. The moment my fingers brushed against the cold wood, I felt a jolt, a pulse of energy that shot through my whole body. It was as if the mansion itself was reacting to my touch. The temperature dropped instantly, and a feeling of dread washed over me, so intense it almost felt like it was seeping into my bones. For a split second, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was behind that door, but the thought of standing there, trapped in that hallway, was even worse. I turned the knob slowly, the sound of it creaking too loudly in the heavy silence. The door opened with a groan, revealing nothing but a vast, empty void on the other side. There was no room, no furniture, no walls, just a dark expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. And yet, I knew somehow that I had to go through it. The pull was undeniable. With shaking hands, I stepped forward. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, I felt the air change. It was thick with something unnameable, like it was filled with static, and for a brief moment, I thought I could hear whispering voices that seemed to be speaking to me, urging me forward. As I stepped further into the void, I felt the air press against me like a wall, thick and suffocating. The whispers were louder now, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as if they were just on the edge of comprehension, teasing me, daring me to understand. Each step felt heavier, like the mansion was reaching out, pulling me deeper into its web. The darkness seemed to swirl around me, alive, watching. I felt the weight of it on my chest, suffocating me, making every breath harder to take. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. They were heavy, stuck to the ground, and the whispers, they were louder now, coming from all directions. I couldn't move. Then, I heard it again, the scratching sound, but this time, it was all around me, closing in. I turned my head wildly, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Nothing but that all-encompassing darkness. The floor beneath my feet began to shift again, rippling like water, as if the very ground was alive. And then, without warning, I felt something cold and wet against my skin, like fingers brushing along my arm, chilling me to the bone. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears, but I couldn't move. The touch was light, almost delicate, but it was unmistakable. Something or someone was here with me. The whispers were now louder, frantic, desperate, and the walls, they were closing in. The dark void was becoming smaller, tighter. I could feel the walls pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. Panic surged through me, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air had turned thick, oppressive, like it was pressing against my throat, preventing me from doing anything. I felt like I was suffocating in that space, but I couldn't escape. There was no way out. The walls of the mansion, it was swallowing me whole. I tried to take another step, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The walls around me weren't just pressing in, now they were moving. They seemed to pulse and shift, as if the entire space was alive, breathing. I could feel it, a terrible energy pushing against me, wrapping around me, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. My vision blurred as the darkness closed in tighter, and I was drowning in it. Then the whispers stopped. Silence, pure, suffocating silence. But it wasn't real silence. It was a kind of silence that makes you feel like something's about to happen. The kind that makes your skin crawl. And I could feel it was watching me. It knew I was there. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything. But all I could do was stand there, frozen, my breath shallow and ragged. And then, as if on cue, I heard a sound, soft at first, barely audible, a low thud, followed by another, then another. It was coming from behind me. I slowly turned my head, and my heart nearly stopped. There was something moving in the darkness, a shape, a figure, but it wasn't like any person I'd ever seen. It was distorted, twisted, like it was part of the mansion itself. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its body seemed to shift, constantly stretching and shrinking in the dim light that seemed to flicker in and out around us. Its eyes, if you could call them. Eyes were hollow, black pits, and when it looked at me, I felt like my soul was being pulled into them. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, raw, as if the air itself had stolen my voice. It reached out slowly, with one elongated hand, its fingers stretching unnaturally long as they crawled toward me. My body screamed to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in that space, trapped by that thing. The fingers were so close now, just inches from my face. I could feel its cold, clammy touch brushing against my cheek, and I knew if it touched me, I would be lost forever, consumed by the mansion. I was already feeling it. The pull, the sinking sensation, as if the ground beneath me was no longer solid. I could feel its fingers brushing against my skin, cold as death, and for a moment, I thought my heart would stop. The touch didn't feel like a human hand. It felt like the mansion itself, as if the walls had turned into something else, something alive, something that wanted me to be a part of it. I wanted to pull away, to escape, but I couldn't move. I was stuck in that moment, paralyzed by fear, unable to even breathe properly. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure withdrew. It wasn't like it decided to stop, no, it vanished. It just dissolved into the darkness, leaving behind a sickening chill that clung to my skin. I didn't know if I should be relieved or terrified. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was thicker now, more oppressive, like something else was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that's when I heard the laughter. Low, guttural, almost like a whisper in the back of my mind, but so close, so real. It wasn't coming from anywhere specific, but from everywhere inside my head, outside, swirling around me. I couldn't tell if it was my own mind breaking down or if something truly horrific was playing with me, but it was impossible to ignore. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I couldn't even do that. I was stuck in the mansion's grip. It had me. It was pulling me deeper, and no matter how much I wanted to fight it, I could feel myself losing. It wasn't just physical anymore, it was mental. I could feel my thoughts slipping away, unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. The walls were closing in on me again, and with each inch, I felt like I was being consumed. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A door. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but no, it was there, clear as day, standing at the far end of the hallway. A wooden door, old and weathered, with intricate carvings that I could barely make out in the dim light. It was real, and I didn't know why, but I had to get to it. It was my only chance. I forced my legs to move, despite the heaviness weighing me down. Every step felt like I was trudging through quicksand, the floor shifting beneath my feet. The closer I got to the door, the more my body screamed to turn back, to leave the mansion behind. But I couldn't. I didn't have a choice. That door was my only hope. As I reached it, the wood seemed to pulse, like it was breathing in rhythm with me. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt, and I thought for a second that I might feel the pulse of the mansion itself through it. I almost let go, but something inside me pushed forward. This was it. The door could be the way out. I turned the handle, and to my surprise, it opened with ease. There was no resistance, no creaking, nothing to indicate the unnatural force behind the house. I stepped into the room, and for a moment, everything felt normal. It was just a room, a small, dusty space with old furniture covered in sheets. The windows were boarded up, but there was an eerie calm about it, a stillness that somehow felt more unsettling than the chaos I had just escaped. But then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, a figure was hunched over. At first, I thought it was just another trick of my mind, a leftover hallucination from the mansion's grip on me. But as I focused, I realized it wasn't. It was a person, a man, his face hidden by long matted hair, crouching unnaturally low to the ground, his body twitching sporadically. The thing that stopped me cold wasn't just his presence, it was the way he was moving. His limbs jerked in unnatural directions, as though his body was being forced to bend and twist in ways it shouldn't. And then, as if sensing me, his head snapped up, and I saw his eyes, empty black holes, staring into me with no emotion, no recognition, just emptiness. My breath hitched in my throat, and I knew that he wasn't alive, not anymore. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like I was paralyzed by his gaze, those empty, soulless eyes. He didn't move for a moment, just stared at me, his head cocking at an unnatural angle, as though studying me, sizing me up. The silence between us felt suffocating, thick with the weight of something wrong, something deeply unnatural. Then, without warning, he lurched forward. His movements were jerky and quick, like a puppet on strings pulled by some unseen force. I backed up, my legs shaking as I tried to force myself to move, but my body wasn't responding as it should. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through water, and the walls around me seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. I could hear the faint sound of whispers, barely audible at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice, it was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and muffled, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The man's head snapped to the side, his body stiffening, and I knew he heard them too. The whispers grew louder still, until they became a deafening roar in my ears, so loud that it felt like the very walls were screaming. I turned to run, but I swear the door had closed on its own. I tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was locking me in, trapping me with whatever that thing was. And then, a soft chuckle. It came from behind me, low and guttural. The sound made my skin crawl, and I didn't have to turn around to know the man was standing right behind me. I felt his presence, the air around me thickening as he inched closer. My chest tightened, and my breath became shallow, as though the room itself was trying to suffocate me. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, cold and foul, like something decaying. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to do anything, but I was paralyzed. I had never felt so vulnerable in my life. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could barely hear the whispers anymore. The man's hand, if it could even be called that, brushed against my arm, cold, clammy, with fingers that felt too long, too stiff. I gasped and tried to jerk away, but my body wouldn't obey. I could hear the cracking of his joints, like dry branches snapping underfoot. His body contorted unnaturally, his spine twisting in a way no human should. And then he was right there, his face inches from mine. But it wasn't his face that I saw, it was something behind him, something in him. The air around us thickened, the shadows stretching in strange, disjointed shapes. The walls of the room seemed to warp, breathing, alive with an unsettling energy. I had to move. I couldn't let whatever this was consume me too. I slammed my body against the door again, pushing with everything I had left, my muscles burning. my heart threatening to explode from my chest. But it wasn't enough. The door refused to budge, holding me in place like a trap. And then, just as I was about to give up, the man's hand reached up and touched my face, cold as ice. The second his fingers made contact, a shockwave of cold shot through my body, and I felt my skin burning. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the shadows around me seemed to close in tighter, pressing against my skin, suffocating me. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of distorted voices, their words unintelligible but full of malice. I finally managed to twist my body away, and that's when I saw the thing inside the man. It wasn't his face anymore, or his body. The skin around his eyes peeled away, revealing something far darker underneath. It was like there was another face beneath his, a twisted, grotesque reflection of something ancient and evil. The eyes, blacker than pitch, were filled with something that felt like hunger. And that hunger, I realized, was directed at me. My body screamed for me to run, to escape, but my legs refused to cooperate. I was stuck there, in that room, with that thing. The air grew even colder, and I could feel the pressure around me intensifying, as if the very walls were squeezing the life out of me. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block it out, but when I opened them again, the man, if it could even be called that anymore, was gone. In his place stood the shadows, swirling in the corners of the room like a storm, moving with a life of their own. They stretched and pulled at the walls, creeping closer to me, as though they were alive, hungry. I backed away, my heart racing so fast I thought I might pass out. The whispers were deafening now, so loud it felt like they were inside my skull, clawing at my brain. They weren't just words anymore, they were feelings, emotions that weren't mine. Fear, despair, hunger. And then I felt something cold and wet creeping up my ankle. I looked down in a panic, only to see black, slimy tendrils reaching out from the floor. It was like the house itself was trying to pull me under, to consume me, just like it had consumed everything else around me. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled back, my head spinning. I didn't know what to do anymore. The door was still shut. There was nowhere to go. I grabbed at the walls, desperately searching for an escape, but the tendrils were getting worse. They moved faster now, snaking up my legs, pulling at my flesh with a cold, sickening grip. I screamed and tried to pull away, but it was no use. I was sinking deeper, the room growing darker, the walls closing in. And then, just as my fingers grazed the edge of a wooden door that had appeared out of nowhere, I heard a voice, low, soothing, like a whisper in the back of my mind. "You're already part of it." I froze. The voice was inside my head now, and it wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a suffocating, cold pressure that weighed down on me, creeping into every corner of my thoughts. The tendrils were still wrapping tighter around me, but the voice was louder now, insistent. It was as if the house itself was trying to claim me, trying to pull me deeper into its rotting, pulsating core. "You can't escape. It's too late." I shook my head, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I tried to scream again, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, the room around me shifting like it was alive, constantly changing. The walls were no longer static, they were breathing, flexing like the chest of something enormous, alive and hungry. I could feel it in the very air, in the floor beneath me, in the darkened corners where I could no longer see. I thought of the others, my neighbors, the squatters who had all disappeared. Had they felt this too? Had they heard the whispers, seen the shadows creeping around, pulling them in? Were they still here, somewhere in the twisted halls of this place, lost to the house? I couldn't remember. Time didn't make sense anymore. Was it minutes, hours, days? It was all a blur. All I knew was that the mansion was alive, beating off every ounce of fear, of despair. I pulled harder at the door, my fingers slipping on the wood, slick with something sticky. My skin was crawling. Every inch of me felt like it was being consumed, not just by the house, but by something else, something more ancient, more sinister. The whispering was overwhelming now, so loud I thought I would lose my mind. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt it. A presence behind me, a weight in the air, the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I turned, and in the dark corner of the room, I saw the silhouette of a figure, standing perfectly still. The figure didn't move. It stood there, almost blending into the darkness, but I could feel its presence. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping even further as I stared at it. I tried to back away, but the tendrils around my legs held me in place, tightening with every breath I took. "It's your turn now," the voice spoke again. But this time, it wasn't just inside my head. It came from the figure, from the shadows themselves. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew, deep down, that whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like stones. My body was numb, frozen by the fear, by the realization that this place, this house, had already claimed me. The figure stepped forward, its movement unnaturally slow, as if it were savoring the moment, savoring my terror. It was wearing something black rags, torn and hanging off its thin body, like the remains of something long forgotten. Its hands reached out, long fingers like claws that seemed to stretch farther than they should have, extending into the shadows. I tried to close my eyes, to block it out, but I couldn't. The figure was getting closer, its steps echoing in the silence. I could feel its breath on my face now, cold and rancid, and with every inhale, I could taste the decay of the house itself. The walls were pulsing with each breath, and the house felt like it was shifting, growing, absorbing everything around me. And then, just as it reached out for me, I felt the floor give way beneath me. I gasped, my hands instinctively reaching for anything to grab onto. But there was nothing. I fell, plummeting into a black void, and for a moment, I thought I was going to hit the ground, that everything would end in a single, painful impact. But then, the fall slowed. It was as if the air around me thickened, cushioning me, holding me suspended in place. I couldn't feel the ground anymore, just the weightlessness of my body and the suffocating cold that clung to me like a second skin. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just coming from the walls or the shadows. They were all around me, inside my head, echoing with 1,000 voices, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. But one thing was clear, there was no escape. I tried to open my eyes, but it was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to see anything but darkness. And yet I felt Itha's presence, the thing from the corner of the room. It was here, with me, just inches away. I could feel its icy breath on my skin, could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, even though I couldn't see it. "You belong to me now," it whispered, its voice soft and insidious, sliding into my mind like oil. My heart raced, a raw, primal terror flooding through me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, as if something invisible was choking the sound out of me. The walls around me began to shift again. The shadows lengthened, twisting into unnatural shapes, crawling across the floor like living things. I could hear the creaking of the house, the moaning of its old bones, as if it was alive and feeding on the terror it created. It was like everything in this place was aware, was alive, and it was all pulling me deeper. I didn't know how long I was falling, how much time had passed. Everything had stopped making sense. There was only the cold, the whispers, and the feeling that I was being slowly consumed, piece by piece, by something I couldn't even comprehend. And then, without warning, I felt the floor again. It was solid beneath my feet, the sensation of something familiar, but wrong. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden shift, and found myself standing in a narrow hallway, the walls stretching endlessly before me. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own, watching me. I took a step forward, my legs shaky, my mind in a fog. The hallway stretched out before me, but it didn't seem right. There was no way I should have been standing here. This wasn't the place I had been before. The mansion had changed again, like it always did, like it wanted to change. The walls were no longer just walls. They pulsed and shifted, like they were breathing, alive, and suffocating me with every exhale. I could still hear the whispers. No, they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, faint but growing louder, coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, cruel, hungry. My heart thudded in my chest, and I began walking faster, instinctively moving away from the sounds, from the madness that felt like it was closing in around me. I reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was old, covered in grime and decay, like everything else in this place. But there was something about it. It felt different from the other doors I had seen. Something about it felt like a way out. I couldn't explain why I thought that, but the pull toward it was undeniable. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling as I gripped it. The cold metal bit into my skin, and I hesitated for a moment. There was no sound now, no whispers, no creaking, just an oppressive silence that filled the space. It felt like the mansion was holding its breath, watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, and I winced at the sound. But what I saw beyond the threshold was nothing. A vast emptiness, a dark void that stretched beyond what I could see. There was no floor, no walls, just an endless black that seemed to swallow everything in sight. But there was something else, too. In the distance, I could make out a flicker of movement, something pale and thin, something that looked like it was crawling toward me from the far end of the void. It was slow, deliberate, and it was coming for me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but the air around me grew thicker, heavier, like the very atmosphere of this place was pushing me toward that void, toward whatever was crawling in the darkness. I stumbled backward, my body shaking uncontrollably. The weight of the air was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. The crawling figure in the void continued its slow, agonizing approach, its movements jerky and unnatural. Each step it took seemed to echo in the silence, making my skin crawl. I tried to turn, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could feel the mansion itself urging me toward that door, like it was guiding me, drawing me into whatever horror lay beyond it. My mind screamed for me to turn away, to escape, but my body was frozen, caught in some unexplainable trance. The whispers came back, louder now, more urgent. They were no longer in the background. They were right here, surrounding me, filling my head. Each voice spoke in a frenzy, as if they were all fighting to be heard, blending into a single, overwhelming cacophony of malice. It's too late. You can't run. It wants you. It's coming for you. I could feel the presence behind me now, something dark and cold, pushing against my back, urging me forward. The figure in the void was closer, its shape more defined. It wasn't human, no. It was something else, something twisted and wrong. Its limbs were elongated, skin stretched thin over its bones, and its face, I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me, studying me with a hunger that made my stomach churn. I forced myself to move, to take a step away from the door, but it was like the mansion was pulling me back, holding me in place. The walls around me seemed to close in, constricting, tightening their grip on me. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me, like the very air had turned to ice. I looked down, my eyes scanning the ground, desperate for anything, any escape. And that's when I saw Ida's small crack in the floor. Barely noticeable, but there, a way out, a trap. I didn't care. My mind was too far gone to think straight. I dropped to my knees, hands trembling as I dug into the crack, trying to pry it open. I could hear the figure now, its breathing slow and raspy, getting closer with every passing second. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the edges of the floorboard, but I kept pulling, desperate to open the crack wide enough to crawl through. The crack widened just enough for me to slide my hand through, and I shoved my fingers deeper, feeling the splinters cut into my skin as I yanked. The air around me seemed to grow colder with each passing second, and the whispers were growing louder, so loud I couldn't block them out anymore. The voices were like nails on a chalkboard, scraping at my sanity, trying to tear me apart. It's almost here. You can't escape. It will have you. I didn't care anymore. I pulled harder. The floor creaked and groaned as if it were alive, but I didn't stop. The sound of the figures crawling became deafening, filling my ears as I gritted my teeth and forced my hand deeper. The walls trembled around me, vibrating with an unnatural force that made the air feel thick and suffocating. Finally, with one final pull, the crack gave way. My fingers slipped into a dark, damp space underneath the floor. I didn't even hesitate. I shoved my arm in, feeling around desperately, searching for something, anything that would give me a way out. My heart was racing, panic clawing at my chest. But then, I felt it. A piece of wood, rough and jagged, but it was loose. I grabbed it with both hands and pulled, and with one violent tug, the floorboard popped up, revealing a narrow opening beneath. There was no time to think. I crawled into the space, my breath ragged, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The darkness swallowed me whole, but at least I wasn't in that hall anymore. At least I wasn't in the mansion's grip. I crawled through the small tunnel, the air musty and thick with the smell of decay. It seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, as though it had been carved by something alive. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but every time I thought I understood, The thoughts slipped away like sand through my fingers. Behind me, I could hear the figure again. It was there, getting closer. Its breathing so loud now that it drowned out the whispers. I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't, but just as I was about to reach the end of the tunnel, my body froze. The sounds behind me had stopped. There was silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I wasn't alone. I turned, slowly, painfully, my eyes strained in the dark, but there was nothing there. I waited, listening. Nothing. And then, in the absolute stillness, I heard it. A whisper, soft and cold, right behind my ear. The whisper was so close, it felt like the words were brushing against my skin. My body went rigid, every muscle locking in place as the cold dread seeped through me. It was almost a relief in some twisted way when I realized that whatever was there, whatever was following me, wasn't human. The air itself felt wrong, thick with an unnatural presence. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer, almost mocking. You can't escape. I wanted to scream, to bolt, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare where I had no control. The tunnel around me felt tighter now, like the walls were closing in, pressing against me, constricting, suffocating. I could almost hear the walls breathing, like the mansion itself was alive, wrapping me in its cold embrace. I tried to look back again, my eyes darting into the shadows, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the oppressive, thick darkness. Yet I could feel it. The presence, it was there. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I crawled faster, heart pounding, hands scraping against the damp earth beneath me. I had to get out. I couldn't let it win. The further I crawled, the more distorted the tunnel became. The walls shifted, like they were alive, bending and warping around me. I could hear the echoes of the mansion's walls groaning, creaking, almost like they were hungry, stretching to pull me back. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, pressing into my mind, urging me to give in. Give in, let go. I shook my head, trying to block out the voices. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it have me. And then, just as I thought I might break, just as I thought I was going to lose my mind, the tunnel opened up. It was a small, cramped space, but it was an escape. A faint light leaked from the cracks in the walls ahead. I pulled myself forward, hands trembling, desperate. But when I reached the end of the tunnel, my stomach dropped. I was back in the apartment complex, not in my apartment, but somewhere else, a place I knew wasn't supposed to exist. The walls were pulsing, moving like flesh. The air was thick with decay, and the flickering light above only cast eerie shadows on the shifting walls. I stood there, frozen, staring at the impossible space in front of me. The whispers, those maddening whispers, were louder now. They were coming from everywhere. They were inside my head, behind my eyes, in the very air I breathed. I was no longer in the tunnel. I was no longer anywhere I recognized. The mansion had consumed the entire building. My legs shook beneath me, threatening to give out as I tried to steady myself. This wasn't right. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The apartment I'd been in was gone, replaced by something unrecognizable. The walls weren't solid anymore. They swelled and contracted, as if the entire space was breathing. The floors were slick, almost like they were melting beneath my feet, the texture shifting with every step I took. I backed away, trying to find some sense of direction, some exit, but the hallway twisted around itself. I couldn't make sense of it. The place felt alive, and I wasn't alone. I could hear footsteps now, heavy, deliberate, but somehow disjointed, like someone or something was moving around, searching for me. I had to keep moving. The fear was unbearable, gnawing at me, urging me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Every door I passed seemed to lead to more endless, shifting corridors. I could hear other people now, too. Faint whispers of those who had been trapped like me, people who had lost their minds, who had been consumed. Their voices were like an echo from another time, lost to the mansion's hunger. I turned down another hallway, the walls closing in on me. The more I moved, the more I realized the mansion wasn't just growing, it was changing. The longer I stayed, the more it swallowed the world around me, distorting it. The air was thick, impossible to breathe, and I could feel the walls pressing against my skin, like they were trying to swallow me whole. In the distance, I saw someone, a figure, standing still in the middle of the hallway. At first, I thought it was another trapped soul, a fellow survivor. But as I got closer, I felt my stomach drop. The figure was wrong. Its body was twitching in unnatural ways, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. Its face was a mask of twisted flesh, contorted in an expression I couldn't place. I froze. I couldn't move. The figure turned its head slowly, its gaze locking with mine, and that was when I heard the laughter. It was soft at first, a low chuckle, but then it grew. It reverberated through the walls, the floor, the air itself. I could feel it in my bones, the vibrations shaking me to my core. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It wasn't human anymore. Whatever it was something else. I stumbled back, but the hallway seemed to stretch forever. It was like the mansion was swallowing everything, every trace of the outside world. The laughter grew louder, closer, and then the voice, again the same voice that had whispered in the tunnel, rang out in my head. It's too late. You are part of it now. The words echoed in my mind, a horrifying truth that seemed to vibrate through every cell in my body. I could feel it, like the mansion itself was pulling at me. The more I resisted, the harder it seemed to grip. The walls, the floor, the very air, everything was twisting, warping into something I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, as if something was squeezing it from the inside. The laughter still rang in my ears, growing louder with each passing second, drowning out my thoughts. I turned around, desperate to find any kind of escape, but the hallway had become unrecognizable. It wasn't just the layout, it was the feel of the place. The walls were slick, covered in some kind of black, oily substance. It glistened in the dim light, and when I touched it, it burned. My fingers slid away, red and raw. The mansion's pulse was everywhere now, beneath my feet, in the air, in the very walls themselves. It was as though it was breathing, living, aware of me. The figure was gone. For a moment, I thought I was alone again, but then the whispers started. They were faint at first, just a rustling in the corners of my mind, but they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the malice behind them. They weren't friendly whispers, like a comforting voice from a loved one. No, these were dark, taunting, full of hunger and cruelty. I had to move. I had to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. Couldn't even tell if I was going in circles. Every door I tried was locked, or worse, it opened into more corridors that led nowhere. The mansion was shifting around me, like it was constantly rebuilding itself, as if it were alive, feeding off the fear I felt, feeding off the panic that was building in my chest. I could feel my sanity slipping away with each step. It was like the mansion had its hooks in me now, and I was being slowly absorbed, piece by piece. The shadows grew longer, darker, swirling in the corners of my vision. The whispers were now unmistakable, words forming in the air around me. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel their intent. They were laughing at me, mocking me. And then, something moved in the corner of my eye. A figure, crouching in the shadows. It was watching me, slowly, almost lazily. It crawled out of the dark and into the dim light, its body twitching in a grotesque way. My heart hammered in my chest, and I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen in place, my body refusing to listen, as the thing, whatever it was, came closer. It was human once, I could tell, but now it was nothing but a hollow shell, skin stretched tight over bones, its eyes wide and empty, its mouth twisted in an unnatural grin. It moved toward me with that same jerky, puppet-like motion. I felt its eyes on me, felt it taking in my fear. It fed off it. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel my heart beating faster, like it was trying to break free from my chest. The thing stopped in front of me, its breath ragged, its skin a sickly shade of gray. It was right there, so close that I could see the veins under its skin, the twitching muscles beneath. I should have screamed. I should have done something, but I couldn't. I could barely even think. Then, without warning, it reached out and touched me. Its fingers were cold, freezing like ice. I could feel the cold sinking into my skin, into my bones. It wasn't just a physical cold, it was a soul-deep cold. A cold that threatened to swallow me whole. And as its touch lingered, the walls around us seemed to warp even more, as though the mansion itself was closing in, feeding off the moment, growing stronger. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like I was suffocating, and the mansion was pulling me in, tightening its grip with every heartbeat. The figure's cold fingers still pressed into my skin, but it wasn't just the cold I felt. It was something else. It was as though it was draining me, stealing my very energy, my soul. I could feel myself weakening, my legs trembling beneath me. I thought I was going to collapse right then and there, consumed by whatever this thing was, whatever this mansion was becoming. The whispers were louder now, like a chorus of voices all shouting at once. The laughter mixed with the whispers, and it was no longer just coming from the corners of my mind. It was coming from everywhere. The walls themselves were laughing, mocking me, as if they knew what was about to happen. And the thing, this creature, whatever it was, lined closer, its breath a cold gust against my face. I could smell decay, something rotten, and I gagged, but no sound came out. I felt paralyzed, trapped in its grip, unable to move, unable to scream. Then, just as quickly as it had touched me, it pulled away. The cold, the pressure, the fire, all vanished in an instant, leaving me gasping for air, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I blinked, confused, disoriented. Was it over? Had it left? But the mansion wasn't done. No, it was still shifting, still alive in its own twisted way. I could hear the walls moving, like something was crawling beneath them, slithering in the dark. The floor beneath me groaned, and I realized I wasn't alone. There were others. I could hear the footsteps echoing in the distance, hurried, frantic. My mind raced, trying to process everything happening around me. What was going on? What was this place? I stumbled forward, unsure of where I was going, only knowing that I couldn't stay in this place for another second. I needed to find a way out. But every time I turned a corner, every door I tried, the mansion seemed to change. The walls, the floor, even the air itself, everything was in a constant state of flux. It was like it was alive, watching me, guiding me deeper into its maze. And then I saw it, a door. It wasn't there before. It just appeared, standing alone at the end of the hallway, a wooden door that looked out of place amidst the shifting darkness. For a split second, I hesitated. Was it a trick? Another part of the mansion's twisted game? But I had no other choice. I couldn't stay here, not with it still lurking in the shadows. I rushed toward the door, my breath shallow, my mind screaming for me to hurry. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, but it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a room beyond. I couldn't see much, just darkness, stretching further than I could comprehend. But there was something about it, a promise of escape, a way out of this nightmare. I stepped forward, trembling, and the door slammed shut behind me. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it like I had stepped into another world. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive weight. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me. And that's when I realized it. I wasn't escaping. I was falling further into the mansion. The room around me began to shift, the walls pulling in on themselves, and I was consumed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices now clear, distinct, and they weren't just whispers anymore. They were calling me. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks anymore. The mansion had me, and it wasn't letting go. The room around me twisted like a living thing. The walls bent and groaned, and the floor beneath my feet felt soft, almost as if it were breathing with me. I could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold sinking into my bones. But the worst part was the growing sense that I wasn't alone. Something was in here with me, something far worse than what I had already seen. I turned in a circle, trying to make sense of the space, but it didn't make sense. The layout was impossible. The corners kept shifting, stretching like they were being pulled in different directions. A door would appear in front of me one second, then vanish the next. There were shadows flickering just out of the corner of my eyes, but whenever I tried to look directly at them, they were gone. It was like the house was toying with me, pulling me deeper into its dark heart. I stumbled forward, my mind spinning. Every step felt like a struggle, my legs weak from the terror that had drained every ounce of energy I had left. The whispers were constant now, louder and more distinct, as though they were no longer just voices in my head. They were in the air, in the walls, all around me. I couldn't tell if they were real or if I was losing my grip on reality, but either way, they were driving me insane. Then, suddenly, I heard something different, a sound that froze me in my tracks. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but unmistakable. A slow, steady breathing, as if something or someone was standing right behind me. I froze, my body tensing. I didn't dare to turn around. The last thing I wanted to do was face whatever that was, but I had no choice. The room was closing in, and the air was getting heavier with each passing second. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I had to know. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head. Nothing. There was nothing behind me, just the swirling, distorted shadows that the house was creating. But then, as I turned to face the shifting walls again, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the room, half hidden in the darkness. It was tall, slender, its features obscured, but there was something about it. Something that made my stomach turn. It wasn't human. Before I could react, it moved. Not in a normal way, but in a way that made no sense at all. It flickered like a broken image, shifting in and out of focus. My mind couldn't process it, couldn't keep up with how it moved. 1 second, it was standing still. The next, it was right in front of me, a few inches away, and I could feel its cold presence pressing down on me. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. That's when I understood. The mansion was alive. It wasn't just a place, it was a creature, an entity, and it was feeding on me, on my fear, on my confusion. Every step I took was feeding it. Every breath was strengthening its grip. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen to the floor. I wanted to run, to get away from whatever that thing was, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The air around me thickened, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands, urging me to do things, telling me to join the shadows, to accept the darkness. The figure, whatever it was, hadn't moved, but I felt it, looming closer. It was like it was just waiting for me to make the first move, to break under the pressure. I could barely breathe, the weight of the room pushing down on me harder than ever. The walls shifted again, narrowing the space, forcing me toward it. The mansion was moving, changing, twisting and contorting as if it was alive and breathing, feeding off my fear. The figure finally spoke, its voice so soft, so smooth, it sent a chill down my spine. You're part of it now. You can feel it, can't you? The words echoed in my mind, making it hard to tell if they were real or if I was losing my grip on reality. But they made sense. I was part of it now. The house, the mansion, it was consuming me, pulling me into its depths. A low, grinding sound echoed through the space, and I realized the floor beneath me had begun to change. It was soft at first, like something alive was crawling beneath it. But then the wood cracked and splintered, sinking into a sickening mush. The walls were no better, they were melting, their surfaces warping and pulsating, like the mansion itself was breathing. I stumbled back, trying to regain control of my body, trying to force my mind to fight back, but the whispers were relentless, scratching at my thoughts. You won't survive. None of you will. You're already lost, they murmured. The last remnants of my will were slipping away, and I knew it. The mansion had won. It had taken me just like it had taken everyone else before me. I turned, looking for a way out, but there was nothing. Just endless, warped corridors, doors that led nowhere, and windows that looked out onto nothing but inky blackness. I was trapped in the mansion's grasp, caught in its endless transformation, its living nightmare. My heart pounded in my chest. Panic began to take hold again, but it was too late. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. The mansion wasn't just a building, it was a living thing, and I had become part of it. I felt it deep inside, in my very bones. It had consumed me. There was no going back. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like hours, but also like seconds. The sense of time had disappeared entirely. All I knew was the endless hallways, the feeling of being followed, the sounds that weren't really sounds, just something pressing against my ears, suffocating me from the inside out. I thought I heard someone calling my name, but I couldn't be sure. The walls were now covered in something slick and dark, like oozing black tar. I tried not to touch it, but it was everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before it would cover me too. I reached out for a door, hoping it would lead somewhere anywhere, but the moment my hand touched the handle, it was as if the door itself shuddered under my touch, and the wood warped, turning to a soft, wet substance that stuck to my skin. I pulled back, my mind racing, but the walls were changing again. A low guttural hum filled the air, vibrating through my chest. It felt like the mansion itself was alive, like it was breathing with me, waiting for me to make the next move. I don't know why I kept walking. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe I was too far gone to turn back. The whispers in my head grew louder, more commanding, more violent. I could feel them twisting my thoughts, pushing me towards something A door that wasn't there before. A corridor that stretched endlessly. My fingers brushed against the walls, and the wetness, it was like flesh, soft and unnervingly warm. Suddenly, I saw the door. It wasn't even a door, really. More like an opening, something that hadn't been there before. But now it was. A wooden frame, old and battered, with a faint light seeping through the cracks. It felt different, like something was pulling me toward it, an irresistible force. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. I reached for the handle, expecting it to melt away like everything else, but it didn't. It was solid, cold to the touch. I hesitated for a moment, but the whispers, the voices, were so overwhelming now. They were all around me, in my ears, in my head, urging me to open it, to step through. My breath caught in my throat as I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The door creaked open, but what lay beyond was nothing like I expected. It wasn't a room, it wasn't even a space, it was just darkness. A thick, oppressive darkness that swallowed the light from the hallway behind me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The air was thick, as if it was alive, pressing against me. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to turn back, but I couldn't move. I was drawn in. I stepped forward, my feet sinking into the soft, spongy floor. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was walking on something that shouldn't exist. The ground was alive, shifting beneath me with each step. There was no telling how far the darkness stretched, but with every step I took, it seemed to pull me deeper. I thought I heard a voice, faint at first, but then clearer, as if it were right behind me. "You came for this, didn't you?" The voice whispered, its tone sweet, almost mocking. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. I took another step, my heart beat loud in my ears. Then I saw a Tata shape moving within the dark, a faint outline, twisting and shifting like smoke. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one, but distorted, its body contorting unnaturally. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in directions they shouldn't have. And its face, God, its face was not a face at all. Just empty, black eyes and a mouth that was stretched too wide, as though it had been torn open. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, my body finally moving on its own. But there was nowhere to go. The darkness was all around me, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder, filling every inch of my mind, drowning out my thoughts. The shape moved toward me with unnatural speed, its limbs stretching and jerking as it got closer. I couldn't look away. The pull was too strong. The darkness seemed to ripple as the figure closed the distance between us. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But I was paralyzed, caught in this nightmare. And then, just as it reached me, everything stopped. The figure froze, its twisted form hanging in the air. The whisper silenced. The ground beneath me was still. The space around me began to shift again, like the walls were closing in, warping around me. I felt the weight of it, the mansion, its walls, its presence pressing down on me, pulling me deeper. The darkness wasn't just a room, it was the mansion itself. And it wasn't done with me yet. I don't know what happened next, or if I even want to know. One moment, I was frozen, staring at that horrific, twisting figure. And then, the next, everything just shifted. The air turned cold, and the suffocating darkness that had been pressing in on me began to feel like it was receding, as if the mansion had decided to give me a moment of respite. But there was no peace. It was all an illusion. The walls of the room, if you could even call it, that began to change. They pulsed, like the heartbeat of some massive living creature. The floor beneath me was slick with something, a substance I couldn't even describe, and the smell, it was nauseating, like rot mixed with something metallic. I tried to move, but I could barely lift my legs. Every step felt like dragging my feet through thick, sticky mud. The figure was still there, suspended in the air, but now it was not alone. More shapes emerged from the darkness, one by one. Each one was a grotesque mockery of a human form, bodies bent in impossible ways, limbs elongating unnaturally, as if they were being stretched. The faces, they were like masks, features distorted beyond recognition. But their eyes, those black pits of nothingness, they were aware. They were looking at me. I turned, desperate to escape, but the room was gone. It wasn't a room anymore. It was an infinite hallway stretching in every direction. Every door I passed was different, each one more grotesque than the last. Some were cracked open, and I could see movement behind them. Shapes that I couldn't quite make out, but felt in my bones. I could feel them, even if I couldn't see them. The walls were breathing with me, like they were alive, like they were watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The whispers returned so loud now, so persistent, that it was impossible to block them out. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You belong to us." The words wrapped themselves around my mind, each syllable sinking in deeper, twisting my thoughts. I thought I saw something at the far end of the hallway, a glimmer of light. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was madness. I couldn't tell anymore, but the thought of escaping, of finding something familiar, made my legs move on their own. My body wasn't my own anymore. I stumbled toward the light, almost tripping over my own feet. The closer I got, the more I realized that the light wasn't coming from any window or lamp. It was coming from inside the walls. Tiny cracks in the wood, little slits where the light leaked through, pulsating and shifting like some living, breathing thing. I reached out to touch the wall, hoping to ground myself, but the moment my fingers brushed the surface, a jolt of pain shot through me. It felt like I was touching something that didn't belong to this world. My hand jerked back, my skin burning. It was then that I heard it scream, a long, high-pitched wail, as though someone knows something was in agony. I don't know why, but it wasn't the first scream I had heard. The house itself seemed to cry out, like it was alive, suffering in a way that I couldn't understand. I tried to scream back, but my voice failed me, and that was when I realized I couldn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. Time had stopped making sense, bending and twisting with every passing second. It felt like hours, or maybe days. But then something changed. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a pressure, like something was drawing closer to me. The light that had been so distant was now right in front of me, flickering erratically like a dying flame. The air thickened, and a low guttural growl filled the space, a sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I felt it deep inside me, vibrating my bones. And then, like an unseen hand had reached out, a hole appeared right in front of me. It wasn't there a moment ago. I didn't even hear it open. It just was. Without thinking, my body moved forward, dragged by some unseen force, as if the house was pulling me closer, forcing me into that black void. My feet barely touched the ground. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't escape it. I was inside. The room, or what I assumed to be a room, was pitch black, save for a faint outline of something in the distance. It didn't take me long to realize it was another door, but this one was different. It was covered in thick, black vines, roots creeping over its surface, twisting like they were alive. Something about the door made my skin crawl, like it had been waiting for me, like I was supposed to be there. And then the voices came back, louder, now, more urgent. They surrounded me, whispered right in my ears. They weren't just words anymore, they were images, flashing in my mind, my memories, distorted, rearranged in ways I couldn't understand. I saw flashes of my past, my struggles, my addiction, my loneliness all twisted into grotesque shapes, like the mansion itself was feeding off my weakness, feeding off my fear. I tried to block it out, but the pressure was too much. I stumbled towards the door, my fingers trembling as I reached for the cold, metal handle. The instant I touched it, a rush of pain shot through me. It wasn't physical, it was worse. It was as though my very soul was being torn apart. And then, something pulled me back. I don't know what it was, but I felt it something darker than any fear I've ever known. Something that made my skin crawl, like the very house itself had a hand around my throat, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body wouldn't listen. It felt like I was trapped inside my own skin, my mind screaming while my body remained still. The room around me seemed to stretch, walls pushing inward, pressing me into that small, suffocating space. The pressure intensified, making it hard to breathe, like the air itself was trying to smother me. And those whispers, they were everywhere now, flooding my senses, choking me. They were no longer just words, they were commands, desperate and demanding. Let go, they hissed in unison, a chorus of voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Let it take you. Embrace it. I couldn't think straight anymore. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was losing my grip on reality completely. Everything I had ever fought for, every ounce of my will to break free, it was all crumbling. But then, like a flicker of light in the dark, I saw something, a figure, just a silhouette at first, but then it took shape. Someone standing at the doorway, watching me, unmoving. Their face was obscured, but I could feel their presence like a cold, tangible force. "Leave now," the figure said, their voice calm but filled with an authority that sent chills through my body. "You don't belong here anymore." I didn't know what to do. The air was suffocating. The mansion was closing in on me, but I had no choice. I stumbled toward the door that had been so far out of reach just moments ago. The closer I got, the more the darkness seemed to retreat. The whispers, though still lingering, grew faint. I reached the door, pulled it open, and stepped through, not knowing if it was escape or another part of the nightmare. The moment I stepped through the door, everything seemed to stop. The pressure that had been crushing me eased, but it wasn't relief. It felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast, something unknowable. The world beyond the door was no longer the apartment complex, no longer the mansion. It was empty, a void. Like the mansion had erased everything, leaving nothing but darkness stretching out in all directions. I looked behind me, and the door was gone, vanished. The space where it had been was now just a blank wall, its texture shifting like liquid, too smooth to be real. The walls were alive, breathing. Everything in this place felt like it was pulsating, waiting, watching. I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of it, but my feet didn't seem to obey me anymore. It was like I wasn't really walking, like the ground itself was pulling me into the depths of this nightmare. My mind was spinning. Was I dead? Had I crossed into some other realm? There were no answers. I couldn't hear the others anymore. My neighbors, the squatters, the people who had been with me. Had they made it out? Or had they all been consumed by the mansion too? It felt like it had been years since I last heard their voices. It was just me now, alone. And then, the laughter. It started softly, like a low hum, echoing through the walls. I couldn't tell where it came from, but it was getting louder, closer. It was a laugh that twisted my stomach, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was no longer just the whispers, it was something else. Something darker, something ancient. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It felt like the ground itself was moving beneath me, shifting with every step I took, as if the floor was trying to swallow me whole. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, my heart racing in my chest. The walls, no, the entire space around me seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways. Hallways stretched out, disappearing into the distance. Rooms I didn't remember entering were suddenly right in front of me, the doors standing wide open, inviting me in, or maybe daring me to step through. The laughter was all around me now, almost as if it was inside my head. I could feel it, crawling under my skin, making my thoughts twist. I couldn't think straight. Every corner I turned, every doorway I passed, felt like I was being led deeper into the heart of the mansion. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I saw the reflection in a cracked mirror on the wall. It wasn't my face staring back at me. It was something else. A hollow, empty expression with eyes that gleamed in the dim light. A face that wasn't mine but felt like it should be. I blinked, trying to focus, but the reflection moved. It tilted its head, smiled, and then vanished, leaving behind only the twisted, cracked surface of the mirror. My heart stopped. Was I seeing things? Was this real? But the fear of the raw, primal fear told me that it didn't matter. The mansion was alive. It was playing with me, toying with my mind. I could feel it, creeping under my skin, pulling at my very soul. I was part of it now. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was unraveling, piece by piece. Every direction I looked, every step I took, the mansion shifted with me. It knew my every move, anticipated my every thought. The walls pressed in around me, growing tighter, colder. There was no way out, no escape. And then, just when I thought I might lose all sense of reality, I heard someone, maybe a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the urgency behind it. It called me, beckoning me toward one of the many doors that materialized before me. I didn't want to go. I didn't trust it, but it was like I had no choice. It was pulling me forward, forcing me toward that door. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, wooden surface. The moment my hand made contact, the air around me grew thick. The temperature dropped so fast that my breath fogged in front of me. My heartbeat quickened. The door, it felt alive, like it was breathing in sync with me, its wooden planks shifting under my touch. I pushed it open, and that's when I saw it. The room behind the door wasn't like the others. It wasn't a hallway, a bedroom, or anything I recognized. It was a vast, empty space, a cavernous void that stretched out into nothingness. The air in there felt wrong. It was thick, suffocating, like it was pulling the very life out of me. And there, in the center of the room, stood a figure. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by shadows. The whispering grew louder, more distinct now, but the words, they weren't for me. They were calling to someone else, something else. I stepped back, heart racing, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside the void. Panic surged through me, but the air in the room seemed to suck all the sound out, as if I was drowning in silence. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and ragged as I backed away from the figure. But it was moving now slowly, deliberately, its shadowy form undulating like it was made of the very darkness that surrounded it. Every step it took seemed to stretch the room farther, pulling me deeper into this nightmare. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My voice felt choked, as though the mansion had swallowed it whole. I felt the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me from all sides. The walls weren't just moving now, they were alive, breathing with me, watching me. I could feel the mansion consuming everything, every thought, every ounce of hope. The figure in the center of the room raised its arm, and I watched in horror as the shadows coiled around it, writhing like something alive. My heart skipped a beat as the shadows began to stretch toward me, curling around my legs, creeping up my arms, pulling me forward. I tried to pull away, but it was like my body didn't belong to me anymore. I was attached to this house, to this thing that was feeding on my fear, on my very soul. I fell to my knees, helpless, as the shadows closed in. My mind screamed for me to fight, to escape, but it was useless. The mansion had me. I could feel the darkness seeping into my skin, my bones, my very soul. It was as if the mansion was taking me in, absorbing me, making me part of it. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't move them. Couldn't move at all. I could only watch in horror as the shadows twisted tighter around me, tightening their grip like a vice. And then I felt it something colder, deeper, crawling into my mind. It whispered to me. The voice was soft, almost loving, but there was nothing kind about it. It promised me release, promised me freedom, but I knew better. I'd heard enough. I'd felt enough to know what this thing wanted. It wasn't freedom, it was consumption. It wanted to consume everything that I was, everything I had left, my fear, my pain, my past. It would take all of it until there was nothing left but an empty shell. Then I heard a scream, a piercing, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't mine, it was someone else's. But the thing that terrified me the most, it was familiar. I recognized it. It was Will, one of the squatters who disappeared days earlier. The last person I thought might still be alive. The shadows shifted again, the room warping around me. I could hear Will's voice, his last scream fading, as if the mansion had already swallowed him whole. I felt the cold rush over me, a terrible, icy wave that nearly paralyzed me. The walls were closing in now, just like they had done with him. It was going to happen to me too. I was going to vanish. I could feel my sanity unraveling with every passing second. The mansion was alive, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy that seemed to wrap around my thoughts, twisting them into something monstrous. My breath was ragged, and I could barely keep my eyes open as the walls grew closer, pressing in like the jaws of some giant beast. I had to get out, but where was there to go? The mansion had consumed everything. The apartment, the alley, the complex, none of it was real anymore. It was all part of the thing that was slowly devouring me. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my body trembling uncontrollably. The shadows stretched toward me again, whispering, urging me to stop fighting, to give in, but I couldn't, not yet. I had to try, I had to survive. I reached out toward the nearest door, praying for something, anything that could lead me to the outside world. But when I touched the handle, it felt wrong. The wood was soft and warm, like flesh, like the mansion itself was alive, breathing through the door. I yanked my hand back, horrified, and that's when I saw it. A faint crack in the wall, a small seam, just barely visible, but it was there. My heart raced. Was it a way out, or just another trap? My mind was a blur, but something primal urged me forward. My body moved of its own accord, crawling toward that tiny opening. The air around me was thick, suffocating, but I had to get to that crack. It had to be my escape. I reached the wall and shoved my fingers into the crack, pulling it apart. But it wasn't a crack at all, it was a mouth. The walls were opening, revealing a black, gaping maw that seemed to breathe in time with the rest of the house. I screamed, trying to pull away, but the mansion was pulling me in, pulling me closer to that horrifying opening. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, trying to pull myself away from the monstrous mouth in the wall, but it was like trying to escape quicksand every time I moved. It dragged me deeper. I could feel my skin begin to stretch as the house pulled me in, the air around me growing colder, suffocating. The walls felt alive, the very house itself conspiring to make me part of it. The whispers in my ears grew louder, mocking me, telling me there was no point in struggling, that I was already gone. I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, but there was nothing there. I looked down, nothing, but the grip tightened, pulling me further into the wall. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. My head spun, my vision blurred as I fought to keep my focus. I was slipping, my fingers barely holding onto the floor beneath me, and then just like that the pulling stopped. I was still in the same spot. The maw on the wall had closed. The whispers were gone. The house was silent. But the silence felt worse than any scream. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe I was imagining things. But as I stood up, I saw it the floor beneath me, the walls around me. Everything began to shift. It was moving again. The house was changing, and I realized the truth. There was no escape, not anymore. The apartment, my once small, safe place, was now just part of the mansion. There was no separating us. We had fused. I wasn't in control anymore. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but before I could release it, something stopped me, something in my chest, like an invisible hand closing around my heart. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, but it didn't matter. The darkness had already taken hold. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against me from all sides, squeezing out whatever little strength I had left. My mind was unraveling. But it wasn't just the fear or the confusion, it was the pull of the house itself. I could feel it, a heavy presence inside me, crawling beneath my skin. It wanted me. It had been feeding on my every fear, every doubt. I wasn't just trapped in the mansion, I was becoming a part of it. And as much as I tried to fight it, I could feel the change happening. The whispers in the darkness didn't sound so far away anymore. They were inside my head. I crawled on the floor, my arms trembling with every movement. But it didn't matter. The mansion's grip on me had become too strong. I could feel it seeping into my bones, taking over my thoughts. In the distance, I heard something scream. Or was it a laugh? I couldn't tell. I couldn't focus on anything but the way the walls pulsed with a life of their own, the way the darkness seemed to breathe around me. There was no direction anymore, no up or down. The house had consumed time itself. I had no concept of how long I had been here or how long it had been since I lost Will or the others. I tried to call out, but no sound left my lips. I couldn't even remember how to scream. The air around me was thick with the scent of decay, and my limbs felt heavy as if the house was draining the last bit of strength I had. Then, in that suffocating silence, the darkness shifted again. A door appeared. I hadn't seen it before, not until it was too late. A heavy wooden door, old and worn, standing in the middle of the hallway, as if it had always been there, waiting for me. I stood up, too numb to question it, too broken to care anymore. The house was watching me. I could feel it watching me. But some shred of instinct drove me toward the door. Maybe it would be different. Maybe this was the way out. As my hand reached for the doorknob, a deep, gout-trenching scream echoed through the house. It was coming from inside me. I turned the knob, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The door creaked open slowly, but there was no relief, no escape. What lay behind it wasn't the outside world, wasn't daylight, wasn't anything I recognized. It was nothingness, a black void, deeper than anything I had ever seen, pulling me in with an insatiable hunger. I stepped forward, my body moving as if it had no will of its own, as if the mansion had already claimed me completely. I could feel the house pressing against me, suffocating me. The walls were no longer separate from me. My body was one with the structure now, fused with its decay and its hunger. The floor beneath me felt like it was sinking, like the mansion was a giant mouth, opening wide, ready to swallow me whole. I tried to step back, but I was frozen. My legs were no longer my own. The whispers were louder now, louder than my own thoughts, than the screams that were still echoing in my head. Then, in that suffocating void, I felt the cold fingers of madness wrap around my mind. The mansion was talking to me now. I could hear its voice, soft at first, but growing clearer with each breath I took. It was telling me what I needed to do. It was telling me I had to finish what had been started. It wasn't enough that it had taken everything from me, no. It needed more. It needed me to let go. Let go of the last piece of humanity I had left. And there, in that moment, I understood. I wasn't just trapped, I was becoming a part of it. The mansion didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to join it, to feed it, to let go of everything that made me who I was, and let the darkness consume me entirely. I had no choice but to listen. The whispers had become too loud to ignore. The voices were cheering me on now, urging me forward. It wasn't my mind anymore. It was the mansion's. I could feel my fingers trembling as they reached for the knife that had somehow appeared in my hand. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't remember anything anymore. It didn't matter. The mansion's will had become my own, and I could feel it coursing through my veins. It was demanding no, insisting that I do this. The last companion I had, the one who had been there with me through this hell, was now standing beside me. But even there, eyes those hollow, pleading eyes couldn't pull me back. The mansion had claimed me completely. The room around me blurred, the shadows deepening as if the darkness itself had come alive. The air was thick, suffocating, and it smelled like rot, like death. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams, screams of pleasure, of triumph. They filled every corner of the room, curling around my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I could hear it. I could hear the mansion laughing now, deep in the walls, in the very foundation beneath my feet. It was feeding. It was feeding on my fear, my madness, and I couldn't stop. The weight of the knife in my hand was the only thing real anymore. The others were gone. The apartment complex, the alley, the mansion itself, they had all blurred together, merged into one grotesque, living nightmare. This was my reality now. The house had taken me, body and soul, and there was no escape. With the blade raised, I heard a final, desperate cry, but it didn't matter. It was already too late. I didn't even feel the final moment, only the silence that followed. And the mansion, the entity that had consumed everything, was satisfied. For now,